Welcome to the mini lecture about post-apocalyptic science fiction. My name is Vera Benczik. I am a senior assistant lecturer at the Department of American Studies at the School of English and American Studies. I teach American literature and classes in popular culture and science fiction, but my main interest lies in science fiction. I have been interested in science fiction all my life. I have been reading and watching science fiction since I was a child. And in the 2010s, I became interested in the abundance of narratives about the end of the world. And this is why my research is mainly concerned with post-apocalyptic science fiction, which I am going to talk about today. The lecture today is entitled After the End, Post-Apocalyptic Science Fiction. First, I'm going to talk about the apocalypse and the post-apocalypse in science fiction in general. Then I'm going to give a brief history and the characteristics of the genre. And then I'm going to very, very shortly talk about the place and the functions of the subgenre in popular culture. Science fiction as a genre, of course, is a non-realistic genre. It belongs to the fantastic. This means that it is distanced from our everyday reality. But despite the fact that it is non-realistic, it is still a rational genre and mainly rooted in scientific thinking, meaning that there is an inherent possibility within the narratives that belong to this category. How is the distance from reality achieved? This is achieved by a set of elements called novum. This is a term that was coined by Darko Suvin, who is a science fiction critic in the 1970s. And these are certain elements that indicate the science fictionality of a certain text. These can be certain objects like spaceships, they can be time machines, but they can be also concepts like time travel or a certain dystopian society that result in a narrative that is dislocated from our own everyday reality. When we talk about the apocalypse, the roots of the word and the concept go back to the Bible. The word itself comes from the Greek, and it means unveiling, revelation. And of course, it refers to the New Testament and the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation, when you look at it, refers to the end point of human history, meaning, of course, that in a Judeo-Christian culture, we perceive time and history to be linear. It starts at the beginning of the creation of the universe, and it ends with the apocalypse, which marks the end point of human history. Now, in science fiction, apocalyptic science fiction and post-apocalyptic science fiction are a subgenre of the texts concerned with the destruction of humanity. As opposed to the biblical background in science fiction, this rarely means the end. In these narratives, survival is a central element, so there is something left after the end of the world, and most of these narratives portray how this survival takes place, how the survivors of the catastrophe integrate and adapt to the changed environment. Now, of course, when we go back to the Bible, I mentioned the Bible and the New Testament, but there are similar narratives that can be found in the biblical tradition. Think about the story of Noah and the flood, which concerns itself with very, very similar concepts, a catastrophe, and the survivors trying to make sense, trying to make life in a desolated earth or on a desolated earth. When you look at the characteristics of post-apocalyptic science fiction, and I briefly mentioned these, you usually have a cataclysmic event or a phenomenon that is a threat to human existence. It is a catastrophic event. This means that it usually happens on a global scale. It is highly destructive, and it happens very, very fast. This also constitutes a traumatic event to humanity. Trauma here, of course, meaning a break in the normal circumstances of life, a rupture or a disruption of life as we normally know it. So it is a threat, it is catastrophic, and it is traumatic. There are several subtypes of texts, several ways in which the world can end. It can come about by a natural cataclysm. Think about floods. Of course, when I refer back to the Bible here, but think about volcanic eruptions, think about storms, or think about the oncoming new ice age. These are all topics, and these are all ways that appear in several films, for example, in the past 2 decades. The cataclysm can also have human origins, meaning that human intervention into nature somehow causes the end of humanity. This can mean, of course, a nuclear war, weapons of mass destruction, or bioengineered threats like viruses or other types of the pandemic. It is, of course, very interesting how COVID-19 very interestingly echoes the catastrophe that we usually associate with the apocalypse. But the threat can also be extraterrestrial, meaning that either an alien invasion destroys civilization as we know it, or an interstellar body tries to or attempts to destroy Earth, an asteroid that crashes into Earth and destroys civilization as we know it. And of course, the cataclysm, this global event, results in global destruction of civilization. Very often this is visualized in a large-scale transformation of the landscape into ruins. Here you can see an artwork that depicts London after a cataclysmic event. You can see the ruined buildings, and you can also see the Thames reduced to a small puddle of water, basically a creek running in the former bed of the Thames. It also results in the decimation of mankind. So usually after an apocalypse or an apocalyptic event in science fiction, only a fraction of humanity remains alive, and this fraction of humanity tries to survive and adapt to the changed circumstances of the world. Now, the history of the motif, of course, has been with us, as I have mentioned, since ancient times. You can go back before the Bible to Mesopotamian literature, which contains very similar narratives of a catastrophic flood destroying large cities. When you look at the Bible, there is always a moral dimension to these narratives. These catastrophic events happen as a punishment for humanity. Sins, narratives like the flood or the story of Sodom and Gomorrah all point to humanity losing its way, and divine punishment is the result of that. Now, when we look at science fiction, the apocalypse and the post-apocalypse appears in science fiction in the 19th century in works of authors like Mary Shelley. She wrote The Last Man, or H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds, which is one of the first alien invasion stories within the genre. But it comes to great prominence in the 20th and the 21st centuries. It gains immense popularity. What is very interesting is that science fiction retains the moral message as well. Only it transforms divine punishment into the natural catastrophes or the catastrophes happening as a result of human arrogance. If humans interfere in nature too much, nature usually comes back with a vengeance. A good example for that is the eco-catastrophes, which usually happen as a result of pollution or of human meddling with bioengineering, for example. When you look at post-apocalyptic science fiction, there is an abundance of texts across the whole spectrum of media. A few examples for that. Of course, you can see examples in print. Here you can see Mary Shelley's The Last Man, but Cormac McCarthy's The Road or The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins all work with a post-apocalyptic background. Film and television, of course, abounds in examples for post-apocalyptic science fiction. The series The Walking Dead or the films I Am Legend or Cloverfield all feature a world that has been destroyed through various interventions into its history, like zombies or a huge Godzilla-like monster in the case of Cloverfield, which levels Manhattan during the film. But they are also very strongly part of video games, and here is a set of video games that some of you may have played, which all feature the destruction of human civilization, and of course survivors, and of course it being a participatory culture, survivors are often the players themselves, making sense, trying to navigate the destroyed landscape of the post-apocalypse. Last but not least, I would like to very briefly talk about the place and functions of post-apocalyptic science fiction in popular culture. What first comes to mind is, of course, entertainment. There is, despite the fact that these are horrendous events, large-scale destruction, decimation of humanity, these narratives, especially the visual narratives, very often contain a sense of pleasure at the destruction. This probably goes back to our childhood when we built small towers and then destroyed them. There is an inherent joy at watching tall buildings fall, for example. Why don't we run away terrified? Because we watch these traumatic events from the safety of our armchair or from the safety of the movie theater. There is and of course we know that this is fiction. So there are safeguards which let us enjoy, witness this catastrophe and witness it as a spectacle rather than being terrified by it. So this is the first function. But of course, as all popular culture narratives, post-apocalyptic science fiction also has deeper meanings and deeper functions. And that, in the case of this subgenre, is to express and reflect on certain fears. These can be collective or global problems that are very present in society at a certain point in history. For example, pollution, global warming, or the pandemic, or the nuclear apocalypse was very popular, so to say, especially after the Second World War, during the Cold War. The collective and global problems also include rapid and significant changes to the environment. So, for example, at the end of the 19th century, urbanization and the incredibly fast growth of the cities also resulted in anxieties which were very often expressed in post-apocalyptic narratives. So this is the collective and global anxieties. But what about personal and individual fears and problems? And I would like to give you a few examples about these sort of personal fears, how they are expressed in post-apocalyptic science fiction, especially in media targeting a young adult audience. For example, some of you may know Warm Bodies, which is actually an adaptation of Romeo and Juliet into a zombie apocalypse, apocalypse background. Now, this film is about isolation and how in this modern technocratic society we cannot really form meaningful connection to other human beings. And to reflect on this issue, the film uses the zombie, the topos of the zombie, as a tool to express this sense of being alone, this sense of inability to communicate with anyone else. Another issue is, of course, for adolescents, this general fear of growing up and the general fear of what am I going to become, how am I going to survive adulthood. And here you have two series. One of them is the Divergent series. The other is the Hunger Games series. Both of them, of course, are based on novels, on trilogies. And both of them are, of course, about survival, but about how adolescents choose what they become and how they navigate the dangerous landscapes of adulthood. Here, of course, the dangerous landscapes are dangerous in reality or in the fictional reality of the post-apocalypse. The Hunger Games is an interesting example because usually you don't think about it as a post-apocalyptic landscape. But when you look at the wider history of Panem, you see that Panem became the political entity it became because of a set of devastating catastrophes that changed the face of the United States. So in conclusion, I would like to sort of very briefly summarize. Post-apocalypse is an integral part of culture, and it finds its expressions in various types of narratives, in religious narratives, in futurological narratives, but also in popular culture narratives that, like science fiction. It is one of the most productive subgenres of science fiction, especially abundant after the 1990s. When you look at streaming services, when you look at video games, when you look at films, several and a large part of science fiction narratives have some element of global destruction of humanity. They function as an outlet for collective and individual fears and concerns, and as a result of that, they are an effective tool for expressing contemporary issues, and also an effective tool to reflect critically on present-day society, politics, and culture. So beyond their entertainment value, which of course, when we consume popular culture products, that is the first thing that comes to mind. Beyond their entertainment value, these narratives are an effective mirror to our society. And science fiction in general works wonderfully as this reflective mirror for social concerns. Thank you very much for your attention.